Hey everybody. This is a section from Anselm Jappe's Guy Debord book. The section is titled The Spectacle 20 Years On, and it's the final section of part 2 of the book, which is titled The Practice of Theory. The Spectacle 20 Years On. When Debord observed in Italy, what Debord observed in Italy clearly informs a great deal of the analysis Debord offers in his Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, published in 1988. Debord's main thesis is based on the perception that in many countries, quote, diffuse, end quote, spectacular power and, quote, concentrated, end quote, spectacular power have now been combined in, quote, integrated spectacle, end quote, of which the Italy and France of the 70s were the pioneers. In the combined system, the essential domination of the diffuse spectacle over the concentrated version is nevertheless accompanied by the introduction of a generalized secrecy and falsification. The integrated spectacle lets no part of the real society escape its control. Instead of hovering above reality, it has, quote, integrated itself into reality, end quote. Reality thus no longer, quote, confronts it as something alien, end quote, for the integrated spectacle has been able to reconstruct reality to suit itself. The continuity of the spectacle is its main achievement in that it has successfully, quote, raised a whole generation molded to its laws, end quote. Anyone who grows up under the spectacle's rules speaks its language, even if their subjective intentions are quite at odds with it. Never before has a system of government attained such a state of perfection as the integrated spectacle, which is why, quote, all those who aspire to govern want to govern this bracket society, end bracket, end quote, and use the same methods to do so. Debord stresses the great distance separating us from the era of pre-spectacular democracy, which now seems almost idyllic by comparison. Among those in power, as much as their opponents, are many who've been too slow to grasp the kind of obstacles that has been too slow to grasp the kind of change that has come about, and who remain unaware of, quote, what obstacles, end quote, governments have been freed from. Comments is a short Comments on Society of the Spectacle. So when I say comments, that's referring to Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. I'll probably end up saying it aloud each time if I remember to, but if I don't, just know that Comments means Comments on Society of the Spectacle from 1988. Comments is a short, dense book from which the optimistic tone used by Debord as late as 1979 has disappeared. By 1988, Debord no longer sees any sign of an organized force capable of opposing the spectacle, and he declares right away that he does not mean to consider, quote, what is desirable or merely preferable, end quote. His comments are to be confined to, quote, recording what is, end quote, even if one can never completely rule out a future reversal of history. Not that the necessary conditions for revolution are absent, but that, quote, it is only governments that think so, end quote. Within the integrated spectacle, struggles are being waged everywhere, but they almost always have an incomprehensible aspect, and their essence remains veiled in secrecy. In the main, they are conspiracies in favor of the established order. Conflicts between different factions of the power structure, even worse, a preemptive counter-revolution, as when a spectacle of terrorism is set up to make the state power as the lesser of two evils. I'm going to repeat that. Conflicts between different factions of the power structure, even worse, a preemptive counter-revolution, is when a spectacle of terrorism is set up to make the state power as the lesser of two evils. Debord stresses that the tendency to see plots or the machinations of police and secret services everywhere, in short, the, quote, conspiracy of history, end quote, was indeed until recently a reductionist belief. Today, however, secret police forces play, quote, the pivotal role, end quote, in spectacular societies. It is they, along with other agencies operating clandestinely, who continually disseminate contradictory, quote, information, end quote, on all aspects of life, so making it impossible to form a clear picture of anything. In this context, the police work in tandem with the media with the disappearance of any kind of community. The individual's contact with the world is entirely mediated through images selected by others who can define their content at will. In contesting every genuine trace of the historical past, the spectacle's aim is to suppress the knowledge that the spectacle is itself a, quote, usurper, end quote, only just risen to power. It hopes in this way, by removing every point of comparison, to impose itself at the best, as the best, indeed, the only possibility. The spectacle creates a perpetual present where the constant reiteration of the same pseudo-novelties erases all historical memory. Consequently, no event can be understood in terms either of the event's causes or of the event's effects, and all logic, not only dialectical logic, but even simple formal logic, is obliterated. Under such conditions, it becomes possible to tell any lie, no matter how inconsistent and fantastic. Any claim made in the mass media, once it has been repeated 2 or 3 times, becomes true, and by the same token, quote, when the spectacle stops talking about something for 3 days, it is as if it did not exist, end quote. The past itself may be remolded with impunity as many a person's public image, and if perchance some truth or other should percolate through the charge of, quote, disinformation, end quote, is always ready to the charge of quote, disinformation, end quote, is always ready to hand. All the autonomous science, genuine learning, and taste for independent and rigorous thought that distinguished the high bourgeois era is fast disappearing. It has become well nigh impossible to, quote, read, end quote, all the items of information, all the lies on offer, each of them corresponding to some particular interest or other. The items collide, overlap, and operate in highly sophisticated ways. Many are tricks, and many openly acknowledge their mendaciousness, the better to distract our attention from something else. Referring to 2 major disasters of the 80s, Debord remarks that people with a large investment in, quote, undersea tunnels will be favorably disposed to the hazards of ferries, end quote, while the, quote, outraged, end quote, competitors of the Swiss pharmaceutical firm that polluted the Rhine Valley were hardly concerned with the fate of the river. Most events reported, however, are as difficult to fathom as the assassination of Olof Palme. Olof Palme was an important social democratic leader in Sweden, I believe. He was killed by, I think, they never really solved his murder. But I believe that people think that he was killed by someone, I don't remember, it might be under the hire, potentially under the hire of people with like ties to apartheid South Africa, which Olof Palme was like doing a lot of things to like shrink Sweden's economic relationship with South Africa. Anyway, that's who Olof Palme is. Or the case of the, quote, mad killers of Brabant, end quote, even though they surely contain a, quote, message, end quote. In these circumstances, it is obvious that no real, quote, public opinion, end quote, can now take form, that the very notion of scandal is anachronistic, and thus that the people who make the decisions are the self-same people who tell us, quote, what they think of them, end quote. How could, quote, citizens, end quote, still be said to exist in such a context? Quote, those who are always watching to see what happens will never act. Such must be the spectator's condition, end quote. Debord. Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. To make matters even worse, a, quote, all-powerful economy, end quote, that has, quote, lost its reason, end quote, deprives the spectacle itself of any strategic vision, prodding the spectacle more and more to act against the very survival of humanity, as witnessed most egregiously the issue of nuclear power. A stage has now been reached at which the spectacle ceases to obey even the laws of economic rationality. In such a world, there is nothing whatever, quote, archaic, end quote, about the mafia. Obscurantism, its incubator, is everywhere on the rise, albeit in new forms: blackmail, intimidation, extortion, the law of omerta. These are precisely the methods whereby the groups in power settle their affairs with a complete disdain for bourgeois legality. No more perfect, quote, modern prince, end quote, for our times could therefore be found than General Noriega, a man who, quote, sells everything and fakes everything, end quote. Is it Daniel Noriega, the Nicaraguan guy? As already noted, Debord now discerns no real opposition to the system and distrusts anyone laying claim to such a role. If the spectacle falsifies everything, it must also falsify the critique of society, and indeed it has gone so far as to cultivate or domesticate or, quote, farmed, end quote, variety of social criticism, deliberately supplying those who are not liable to be satisfied by the standard explanations with supposedly restricted information, from which, nevertheless, the really essential material is missing, and that is not all, for the integrated spectacle's, quote, highest ambition, end quote, is, quote, to turn secret agents into revolutionaries and revolutionaries into secret agents, end quote. Footnote. There's a footnote that I missed. It said, these remarks were made more than a year before Noriega's downfall. At the end, perhaps, the general's provocations and play acting simply went too far. This outcome would have appealed to the admirer of Retz and Debord. Back to the end footnote. Thus, quote, no one can be assured that they are not being tricked or manipulated, end quote. Such a system has every reason to defend itself because it represents a, quote, fragile perfection, end quote, and can no longer survive reform, even of its, quote, most trifling detail. Henceforth, the main enemy of the spectacle will be the spectacle itself. Its warring factions broadcast a mass of false or unverifiable information that makes calculations extremely difficult even for those at the commanding heights of society. The spectacle's main problem, in a word, is that the spectacle is that its jettisoning of all logic, all sense of history, all contact with reality eventually makes it incapable of managing society in a way that makes sense even from its own point of view. When Debord's comments first appear, some of its theses may well have seemed rather startling. One might have been excused for wondering whether Debord, who had probed so deep into the roots and mechanisms of power in the modern world, had somehow been converted to a, quote, primitive, end quote, view of domination that saw intrigue and espionage everywhere. There is no denying, however, that the years since the book's publication have confirmed its claims in myriad ways. In the wake of the collapse of the Eastern European regimes, the preponderant part played in those events by the secret services of the countries concerned became quite clear. They had not hesitated to organize protest demonstrations or to add fuel to the flames of spreading rumors about supposed assassinations, as in Prague in 1989. It now appears that in the former East Germany, almost all the leaders of the opposition to the Stalinist regime worked for the secret police, or, quote, Stasi, end quote. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that a portion of the evidence upon which these charges are now being faced was forged earlier by interested parties as ammunition for future use against their rivals. The Stasi archives have been opened, but a good many documents could well have been falsified by the Stasi itself, which may indeed still be operating undercover. Meanwhile, we can only speculate as to the possible role of the Stasi chief, Markus Wolf, in the run-up to the capitulation and recycling of the country's Stalinist bureaucrats. In Romania, distortion by the media was especially flagrant. The Western press clearly used photographs of the victims of repression in Timisoara to support fatality figures, and that had in fact been multiplied tenfold, less effectively fanning the flames of revolt. Footnote. After writing these lines on a, quote, fact, end quote, that had been widely reported, particularly in France, I was told by a participant in the Timisoara revolt that the scale of the tragedy was, in fact, even greater, and that the figure of 4,000 dead was a serious underestimate. Whatever the truth of the matter, the point is that it is extremely difficult in our, quote, global village, end quote, to get any clear picture of events at all. End footnote. The numbers of dead at Tiananmen Square in 1989 seem likewise to have been much exaggerated. During the Gulf War, the long list of Saddam Hussein's crimes was eked out by the worldwide distribution of the picture of an innocent cormorant soaked in oil, the presumed victim of Iraq's destruction of wells. Only after the war did someone point out that no such cormorant ever visited the Gulf region during the spring, at which point it was admitted that it was a file picture of a bird caught up in the ecological catastrophe in Brittany years earlier. More important for all the media's chatter about the, quote, global village, end quote, the fact is that we were never told how many Iraqis died in the Gulf War. 15,000, 150,000, no one knows. All information released had to conform absolutely with the interests of that controlled its sources. Sometimes there may be comfort to be drawn from the fact that the world may not be quite as terrible as it appears in the media. On the other hand, we have to reckon with everything that the media systematically conceals. Debord's comments on the society of the spectacle makes the perhaps extravagant claim that numerous people who would normally be considered beyond suspicion, particularly among artists, are in fact associated with the secret services of the state. And indeed, we have now learned that many of the writers of the former East Germany were police informers. And the export of pop art to Europe in the early 60s was supposedly decided upon at the highest level of the United States government and organized by the CIA. Footnote, or so says Enrico Baj in his Cos dell'altro mondo. Yeah, just a side note, the Congress for Cultural Freedom or whatever, is that, they put money into things like a partisan review and promoted things like abstract impressionism, abstract expressionism, right? Yeah, and those kind of things. But that didn't mean that the people who, produced those pieces of art were, involved in them. So some people try to act like people like Dwight McDonald or, Jackson Pollock, were spies or something like that. And that's a misunderstanding of how the, Congress for Cultural Freedom, I believe it's what it's called. I can't remember the exact acronym. I think that's right, though. Yeah. Anyway, where are we? Italians may well need less convincing than others when it comes to the scathing views set forth in comments. They are, after all, only too well acquainted with the interpenetration of mafia in politics, and more generally with the creation of new logics of influence peddling based in the main on access to certain secrets. Anyone in Italy who followed the official inquiries into an event such as the, quote, tragedy of Ustica, end quote, when on the 27th of June 1980 a plane with 81 people on board crashed into the sea, probably brought down by a missile, quote, of unknown origin, end quote, or into the, quote, state massacres, end quote, of the 70s, knows full well that what it means to be inundated with countless contradictory versions of the truth, all presented by so-called experts, so that it becomes quite impossible to identify the real interest involved. What Debord describes is the combination of the oldest with the most modern methods of domination, and this is an area where Italy probably leads the world. One might reasonably object, nevertheless, that there is nothing so very new about such phenomena. The case of many powerful figures of the past cast not a little doubt on the claim that, quote, for the first time in history, it is possible to govern without the slightest understanding of art or of what is authentic and what is impossible, end quote. Guy Debord comments on the Society of the Spectacle, 1988. There seems, however, to have been some hesitation on Debord's part about the question whether the spectacle is in crisis or not. The social agitation of the 70s and perhaps also a wish to assign as much significance as possible to 1968, and hence to himself, led Debord in comments to assert that nothing is as it was. In 1979, Debord had written that the spectacle began by, quote, believing itself loved, end quote. But, quote, now, the spectacle no longer promises anything. The spectacle no longer says, quote, what appears is good, what is good appears, end quote. The spectacle simply says, quote, it is so, end quote, Guy Debord. And that was why, quote, its inhabitants have split into two parties, one of which wants the society to disappear, end quote. A few years later, still, Debord observed that, quote, the spectacle does not debase men to the point of making them love it, end quote. Debord comments asserts that modern society is now content merely to intimidate, being well aware that, quote, its innocent air has gone forever, end quote. Quote, no one really believes the spectacle, end quote, which indeed inspires, quote, general contempt, end quote. Today, quote, servitude, end quote, offers no compensatory advantage and, quote, truly wants to be loved for itself, end quote. In short, the spectacle no longer has the approbation of its subjects, and this amounts to a considerable defeat. Debord's chief claim to glory, in his own view, is that he, quote, helped bankrupt this world. He helped bankrupt this world, end quote, Debord. In Debord's presentation of the reprint edition of Potlatch, Debord asserts that the ideas expressed therein, quote, eventually brought ruination, end quote. to the, quote, banalities, end quote, of that period. All this sits uneasily with the analysis also proposed in comments, according to which the spectacle is more highly perfected than ever, and that the spectacle, quote, has succeeded in raising a whole generation molded to its laws, end quote, Debord. The fact is that the last of Debord's works are by no means concerned with the struggle between masses in revolt and the spectacle, but rather with the imbecility of a world where everyone has succumbed to the spectacle's tyranny. The truth may well lie somewhere between these two extreme positions, to which Debord was led to two contending needs: the need to magnify the historical changes provoked by the Situationist International, and the need to point up his own uniqueness against the backdrop of a somber world. From a less psychological point of view, it is certainly arguable that the spectacle now generates far less enthusiasm than the spectacle once did, that people who truly believe in the spectacle are few and far between, but that there are many who know how to turn participation in the spectacle to their own account. On the other hand, to say as Debord does, that, quote, the reigning imposture may have been able to get anyone and everyone's approval, but at least it will have had to do without mine, end quote, has something overweening about it, and underestimates the antagonists that spectacular capitalism continues to arouse more or less everywhere. We shall return to this issue in part 3. Okay, so that is the end of The Spectacle 20 Years On, a section from part 2 of Anselm Jappe's Guy Debord. The next thing that I'll be reading is the first section from Part 3. Part 3 is titled Theory, Past and Present, and the first section is titled The Situationist Critique in Historical Context. Thank you for listening. I hope you got something out of it. Bye-bye.